Alright, so yes, this will be the behind the scenes for the iceberg lettuce video that I just did. So we're going to be running through the animations and the visual effects that I put together in that video, and also the thumbnail as well, because I know a lot of people have been asking how I make my thumbnails. So yeah, hopefully you guys find this interesting and get something out of this, hopefully. So yeah, so the first opening shot is the graveyard shot. Here it is. So here it is in After Effects. Here are all the the little layers. So what I did first was, so the first thing I did was I brought up this as a reference, because I wanted this, but kind of in the snow, just to kind of fit with the theme, and also to try and make the video kind of a little bit of a continuation, because it is the same mods I'm using. So I took this and I put together this, but obviously everything's dead and it's snowing. So the first thing I did to try and recreate that snowy feel was to draw like a dead tree, because this shot has some trees in the background and foreground. I did that in Photoshop. So it's broken up into the base sketch. I did a little sketch first to try and get something looking like a tree. Then I coloured it in, a nice tree colour, and added some kind of like some details onto the tree just to make it look a little bit more realistic. I mean, I wasn't going for like 100% realism, but that little extra detail does kind of like lift the drawing a bit more. There's a knot there in the tree, there's some lines where the bark would be going and things like that. And then on top of that, I added a layer of shadows, some highlights and some shadows. And again, not the best illustration in the world, but that's kind of helped a little bit to try and make the tree look that little bit more realistic. And then I added snow, which I first started with a little sketch of where I wanted the snow to go, and then I coloured in the snow just a plain white. And I think it would be at this point that you'd perhaps line the drawing if you wanted to do some more like confident lines, some like thicker, less sketchy lines. But I quite like the sketchy look, so I just didn't. So then I took the tree into After Effects, and it's literally just a layer by itself. So yeah, I just whacked the trees in, and yeah. And the next thing I did was I wanted to add some clouds. Because this would be like in the day, I couldn't just have like an endless expanse of darkness like I had with this, which kind of like did a decent job of covering things up. There's a bit of mist and rain and such, but for the most part it's just a completely black background. So I started off with, this is a white to light blue gradient that I added in the background for the very background. And then on top of that, I drew some clouds. Again, I drew these clouds in Photoshop. So for the clouds, what I did was I took my base background color, which in this case was a light blue, and just basically did some vertical squiggles. And then on the top, added a bit of white, and on the bottom some black. And then I took my smudge tool, and I literally just went to town on the clouds to try and like mess them up and kind of warp them and make them look like clouds, that sort of thing. And I basically took this PNG and whacked it in the background there, and we've got a half decent kind of cloudy look. So the next layer is the tombstone, and again I wanted to try and match the look as close as possible, and for that I once again took to Photoshop and I imported the original drawing, erased a bit, and then added some snow. This is like one of my earlier drawings where I for some reason used the technique of drawing it in Photoshop and then colouring it in After Effects for some reason, and then taking it to After Effects. And if we open this comp here, we have a coloured in version, and it's literally just shape layers. And then I added a adjustment layer, and an adjustment layer is essentially an invisible layer that you can put effects on in After Effects. So if you wanted to add like a blur or something to everything, you could add an adjustment layer and then apply it to the adjustment layer, and everything underneath it would have that effect, instead of having to do it for each individual like layer. You could do it for one. Okay, I don't know why it's still there, but I put a fractal noise, which kind of just adds a little bit of grime, just to kind of bring out a small bit of detail that wasn't there in the original drawing, and a CC plastic, which is doing most of the work when it comes to lighting. And so CC plastic essentially just adds bumps to your drawing and then simulates light, just adding some highlights and some shadows to the tombstone in the snow, just to make it look a bit more 3D, make it pop a little bit more. So on the bottom here is just a blue solid with a feathered mask applied to it. And then the final part, just to kind of finish it off, the icing on the cake, it's this snow. I've taken a white solid and applied a CC particle world to it. And this basically just simulates particles moving around, and you can adjust the gravity and the direction. Well, not even any special particle I used, it's just a built-in lens fade that I've coloured white and blue, and I put all of that into a comp and then added a virtual camera. And doing it this way means I don't have to hand animate each individual frame. I can just whack it all in After Effects and it do most of the work. So the camera pans through, revealing the second tombstone behind it, which is the Battle for Neighborville tombstone. And this is the old tombstone drawing, and I've just changed the logo and the date. That's basically it. And I've also drawn some snow on in After Effects because I forgot to do that beforehand. And to make it fade in, you know, just an altered opacity. And then to add kind of that bluey tint to make it look like it's coming out of fog. I mean, that was the original intent anyway. I wanted to make it look like it was emerging from fog. But after I rendered, I realized that the tree was behind it, and the tree would also have to emerge from the fog. So I just left it. But it's a tritone effect that I'm just blending with the original. And that's basically it, really. It's not a very complicated opening sequence, but just kind of adds a little bit of atmosphere and a little bit of mood, I think, to the video. Right, and the second animation that I included in the video was this. It was kind of just a credits, a very simple credits, with the iceberg lettuce bouncing in over the text. This is an effect that I've done quite a lot. It's quite simple. If I open up one of these, so it's the text with a displacement map and a roughened edges applied to it. Then underneath that, I've added the same, which has been copied and pasted, and added a glow and upped the displacement a bit more. And so a displacement map is essentially, how can I best describe it? So you take a layer like this, which is just black and white pixels that move around, and the displacement layer takes the alpha channel from this layer here and applies it to a different layer. And so where it's white, pixels are on, and where it's black, pixels are turned off. So it applies that data to something else. So if we get rid of that and look here, the only reason it's jittering is because the purple is moving to where the white is and disappearing where the black is. And because the black's constantly shifting around, so are the turned off pixels, and so it looks like it's like kind of jittering about. I think I explained that in a super layman's way, but that's basically the gist of that. And also a little bit of a glow added as well. Just again, make it pop a bit more. And so yeah, that's that. The same for that. It's just a simple fade, just changing the opacity. And then here where the iceberg lettuce bounces in. So this is where I kind of realized that the method that I was using for frame by frame animation beforehand was dumb. I was using Photoshop beforehand and it took forever. And then I discovered a little app called Pencil 2D. It's a free piece of animation software. Very simple, but it gets the job done. And that's what I use to create the base animation. So I try to take the most advantage out of an animation principle called squash and stretch. So essentially, what squash and stretch is, when something's falling, it kind of stretches out a bit because of gravity. Gravity kind of pulls it apart, and then when it hits the ground, obviously it squishes back together. Just it makes things look a bit more bouncy and a little bit more fluid, and that's kind of what I wanted to go for with the iceberg lettuce, because the character is essentially just two snowballs, and in my head that just means, you know, almost liquid, you know. And I wanted it coming bouncing in, so it starts off small, gets larger and larger. And these are very rough. I mean, I could have spent more time cleaning up these images, but I wanted the video out at a decent time. And so yeah, I mean, I think it turned out pretty good, and especially for one of my first pieces of frame by frame. There's definitely things to improve on, but that's how I did it. Bouncing in, getting larger, stretching, squashing, and then the top one bounces off the bottom one. And then they both take off and they meet again, and then they squash down. And again, using squash and stretch, I made the iceberg lettuce kind of like shoot out its spikes by kind of like sucking its head in, expanding its head, and then squashing down and the spike shooting out, then it coming back to its normal position. And also to kind of, again, add a little bit more life and a little bit more of a story to the animation, I made it drop little bits of snow every time the character landed. And here I added some little particle business, but you don't notice it, so I just didn't bother with the second bit. And again, these use a very simple version of squash and stretch. So yeah, I did this. So yeah, this one's the color layer. I went through and I colored in the images, and then I went through and added the shadow. There's only shadow on some, because I knew I'd do it later in After Effects anyway. Obviously it's quite janky, and I did end up rubbing out a lot of the color that spilled over the edges in After Effects, but that's kind of the rough base animation that I ended up with. So I took that. So yeah, I took this and I exported it as an image sequence, which gives you basically a PNG for every frame that you drew. And I took those and I put them into After Effects here. I put them in, I sequenced them to last the frame. So we've got the animation here, and I made it so that it kind of like does that thing again to transition out. So once I took it into here, I duplicated the animation here to add, again, more shadows and a bit more lighting. And to the duplicated layer, I added again a fractal noise just to add a bit more detail, and the blur just to very subtly kind of even out the really awful colouring, and I did. And on this regular layer is again a CC plastic, which again I used to try and mimic some sort of light. And in this case, I set the light to purple, just so it looked like the glow on the text was having some effect on the iceberg lettuce. But yeah, just to kind of bring the text and the animation into the same scene, make it look like they're existing together. And for this jumping over, it's very simple. I literally just split the layer in two, and whilst the character's in this position, just dropped the split layer underneath, just so you can't really tell. I mean, you can. If you notice the snow here, kind of reveals what I did. It literally just pops forward. This fades out, and I also faded out the CC plastic, again to try and tie the elements together. And yeah, for those wondering, I do use Premiere to edit. I don't know, it's just what I'm most comfortable using. Okay, so once that's all done, it's time for the thumbnail. So here we go, here's the thumbnail. So what I did was, look at all these layers, oh boy. So I started off with the Garden Warfare logo. Actually, before even that, I started off with this background grey. And this grey does have a story. There's a reason why I have this colour in particular. I mean, first of all, light is so much more visible on a dark background. But that's not why I picked it. The reason I picked it was because it's the background colour for the Tabs unit creator. And it's a long story, but I used to be a different kind of YouTuber. I wasn't always a Garden Warfare YouTuber. I used to be a Tabs YouTuber back when I was a little bit smaller. And this was the colour of the unit creator background, and it's a nice grey. It's not complete darkness, and yet it's still dark enough for me to apply things with light over the top. And so I got me a Garden Warfare logo, duplicated it, and I changed the blending mode to linear dodge add, and then added a Gaussian blur over the top. Duplicated that again with the same effects, then went back to this one and changed the opacity to half. So this is what it looked like by itself. Changed the opacity to half, and then changed the Gaussian blur for this one to be more. So the blur on the top, there's a higher radius of the blur on the top than there is the bottom, and that just kind of gives it a deeper glow. And on top of that, we have the iceberg lettuce, which itself is made up of a fair amount of layers. So you got your base image here, which I cut out of a screenshot of the character booth. So yeah, I started off with this. This is the image I started with. I cut the image out, and on top of it, I applied a levels effect, which just darkens it all. And on top of that, a curves, which lightens it all. And then what I did was I inverted the curves adjustment layer mask, and with the paint tool kind of painted around the side, just so I could get light around the edge, just to be like a bit of an edge light. And then because this character kind of has an ice trail in every game, so here's the ice trail, and it's just white paint. So I got my my Photoshop paintbrush and just scribbled a bunch of white paint. And then what I did was I duplicated it and made one of them dissolve. So I chose blending mode dissolve, just to kind of add some little particly bits, some bits of frost, some bits of snow, and then applied that over the top of just my base kind of paint layer. And on top of that, we have a little shadow that I again just painted on, and then I duplicated that again for the shadow. So the shadow is basically that. It's been vertically flipped, and then I've applied a color overlay to it, to black, and half the opacity. And that's the exact same technique I used for the shadow for iceberg lettuce itself. I gave it a black color overlay, I halved the opacity, and I also added a radial blur, which is up here in filters, blur, radial blur, and what I did was I changed it to zoom and I upped the amount a little bit. It just adds like a small bit of ambient occlusion. So for a shadow, it's going to be darker closer to the subject, because that's where, you know, all of the light's being blocked by the subject. So the closer the shadow is to the subject, the darker it's going to be, and the further away the shadow is from the subject, the lighter it's going to be, because not as much light is being blocked. And so with a radial blur, I try and bring that out. So you can see it's a little bit faded on the side there, and a little bit thicker on. It's not the best, but I changed the opacity to half, so you can't really notice the shadow anyway. It's just kind of a little extra touch that you notice at a glance. So that's basically how I put together most of my thumbnails. It's just a glowy logo with a character with an edge light. Quite simple, so there you go. So yeah, that's basically everything. So I hope you find this useful and can apply some of my limited knowledge to whatever you're doing, or it inspires you, or you just, just find it interesting and just want to know just because of curiosity. But, thanks a lot for watching through this, and yeah, that's about everything. Have a good one.